Nerdrotic.com.
It's been 4,082 days since the release of the last book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series, A Dance with Dragons. That's over 11 years without the Winds of Winter. Must be time for a House of the Dragon review. But before we get started, let's address a couple of issues. House of the Dragon is a popular show. So much so, it's not only retaining its viewers, it's increasing its viewership. House of the Dragon viewership up 5% with episode 4 exclusive from Variety. And not only that, the premiere episode, which according to HBO was the biggest premiere of all time, has now been watched by over 30 million people. And if we are to believe these numbers, that's an incredible feat considering the House of the Dragon is pinned squarely behind the Game of Thrones Season 8 ball. But popularity has nothing to do with why I like this show. And yes, I was incredibly hard on it before it came out based on everything I heard from the Access media and the show's creators, and knowing what I know of the source material, which I've actually read and still don't like. House of the Dragon is based on a series of chapters in Fire and Blood Part 1, an unreliable history from an unreliable narrator sourcing 3 unreliable narrators. A book that delayed the Winds of Winter, and as a much bigger fan of the A Song of Ice and Fire series than either of these shows, of course I'm pissed, so I'm as surprised as anybody that I like it. And I think it's a vast improvement on George R.R. Martin's self-indulgent source material so far. And it hasn't made the mistakes every streaming service has made with their big tentpole series that they've dumped millions of dollars into, and we'll get into that later in the video. 4th episode is called King of the Narrow Sea, another one named after Matt Damon Targaryen, and although Matt Smith was great again, this one belongs to Paddy Considine. I'm going to mispronounce names, just get used to it. Starts out with Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen on her Westerosi looking for a husband to her. Lord Dondarrion's too old, Lord Blackwood's too young, but we do get a cool scene and a cool deep cut from the books. The feud between the Blackwoods and the Brackens, the Hatfields and McCoys of Westeros. And we do get a deep cut from young Willem Blackwood. Rhaenyra cut short her tour by 2.5 months, and apparently she's been on it for almost a year. So she leaves Storm's End, and that was the first time we got to look inside of that castle, and heads home to face her father's wrath. But coincidentally, Matt Damon Targaryen returns and essentially saves her ass. So after defeating the Triarchy on the Stepstones, he was named by Corlys Velaryon's men the King of the Narrow Sea, hence the name of the episode. Matt Damon Targaryen immediately bends the knee, hands over his crown, and makes up with King Viserys, and he's definitely up to something. Then there is a series of conversations in front of a werewood, and I can't help but think maybe this is what Bran was watching that whole time towards the end of Game of Thrones Season 8. And poor King Viserys, he just wants things to work out and his family to be happy, and of course it's going to start a civil war. Prince Rhaenyra complains to Alicent, of all people, that she doesn't want to be a prisoner in someone's castle churning out heirs. Awkward. In the next scene, she asks Daemon directly what he wants. It should be obvious at this point. Rhaenyra fears that she will end up like her mother, just spitting out heirs and then dying, and Daemon has a pretty good response to that. Now, I'm not going to bother to go back and check, so you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, because I'm never going to watch Game of Thrones ever again, but it feels like the High Valyrian is much more natural in this series, and they're just doing a better job with it. Now it's time for that Rings of Power comparison, which is impossible not to do since we have 2 fantasy shows going up against each other. And yes, the fact that something that is based on Tolkien is far inferior to something George R.R. Martin should be against the laws of all imagination and creativity. Yet here we are, where the Rings of Power relies completely on tell, not show, especially with their main character, Galadriel, who essentially interacts with NPCs and not other real characters. In House of the Dragon, the 2 conversations between Rhaenyra and Alicent and Rhaenyra and Daemon feel like 2 actual separate human beings are talking to each other, and all 3 characters are moving forward in the story. I'm sorry to break things down to a kindergarten level, but that's where we are in Hollywood right now. This setting up a sequence of scenes that actually show us the contrast between Alicent Hightower and Rhaenyra Targaryen instead of just telling us. Last week we got some battle, this week we get some boobs. And almost that trademark Game of Thrones interfamily coupling. Now the seeds of the great Targaryen civil war have long been planted, but this series of scenes is where they start to grow. Rhaenyra goes back to her apartment and finds some clothes and a map that lead her through a secret passage to meet Daemon. King Maegor the Cruel had all of these passages built in the Red Keep to easily escape his enemies and of course go out and do cruel things. He also threw a big party for the men who constructed these passages and then killed them all. Matt Damon Targaryen takes Rhaenyra out for what seems to be an innocent night on the town with her dressed as a boy. Daemon first takes Rhaenyra to a mummer show, a play, to give her an idea what the small folk think of her possible rule, which isn't much. Rhaenyra says the small folks' thoughts are of no consequence to her, and Daemon reminds her that they should be. Reminder, Daemon is beloved by the small folk in King's Landing, and that's why in the books anyway, he's referred to as the Lord of Fleabottom. Rhaenyra tries to take off on Daemon, and she runs into a gold cloak, Harwin Strong, the son of Lionel Strong on the small council. Now, this little chance meeting is going to have huge repercussions on Rhaenyra's character later. Then Daemon takes Rhaenyra to a pleasure house, and it looks like those two are about to pleasure each other, and then Daemon backs out last minute. Now, is this a possible setup? Because before they walked into the pleasure house, Daemon took off Rhaenyra's hat, and the answer is maybe. Daemon then abandons Rhaenyra, who's all fired up. She manages to find her way home and jumps Sir Criston Cole. For those of you who have read the book, you know that they alluded to Rhaenyra and Sir Criston Cole getting it on, but they never specifically say it, but now we know. Now, the scenes with Rhaenyra are contrasted with the scenes of Alicent being the dutiful wife, holding her crying baby, going to bed at night alone, and then being woken up in the middle of the night to do the king. A task she clearly doesn't enjoy, and this time King Viserys notices. Turns out someone noticed Daemon and Rhaenyra in the pleasure house, a little bird, who goes straight to Harwin Strong and then to Otto Hightower. We get a great little moment where Otto Hightower is either wondering if he should tell the king or not, or he's just mentally preparing himself to tell King Viserys that his daughter was interfamily coupling in a pleasure house. Or Otto is just getting ready for what he thinks is his moment, knowing that he has to use his words very carefully. King Viserys doesn't believe him and then finally calls out Otto for what he's actually doing, trying to supplant Rhaenyra on the throne. Now, Daemon and Rhaenyra did not couple. They came very close, and she clearly wanted it more than he did. But it doesn't matter, as King Viserys tells Rhaenyra later in the episode. It's all about perception. King Viserys kicks Otto out, and then the next scene, we're back in front of a werewood with Alicent confronting Rhaenyra. Again, the werewood that was never in King's Landing shows up so much that you have to think they're going to connect it to some kind of three-eyed crow or the children of the forest, and that worries me. Now, Alicent is obviously mad at Rhaenyra for screwing up her own chance of getting on the throne. Alicent has put her own work into it, but there's also something else going on here. And I think this has something to do with the faith of the Seven. Obviously, Alicent is a very religious person, and the faith only suffers the Targaryen interfamily self-coupling. And the faith used to be based in Old Town, where the Maesters of the Citadel are based, and the Lord of the High Tower. Rhaenyra convinces Alicent that she didn't do Daemon while at the same time lying by omission and leaving out jumping Sir Criston Cole. Daemon's a little hungover from the previous night's festivities, and he's offered a little scale of the dragon from the White Worm, Misseri, who is obviously our mistress of whispers when you see her getting paid by the little bird, and she's either in league with him or selling him out, or both. Daemon eventually gets dragged hungover to King Viserys, and we finally find out what he wants: to marry Rhaenyra. That damn Valyrian steel knife from Game of Thrones Season 8 comes out, you know that's going to come up later. Viserys once again exiles Daemon to his quote-unquote bronze bitch in the Eyrie, and once again we see that damn knife. Borrowing heavily from Lord of the Rings, when you heat the Valyrian steel knife, you see inscribed on it the A Song of Ice and Fire, the prophecy of the prince that was promised, which still could possibly be a Winds of Winter spoiler or just fan service. Again, King Viserys tells Rhaenyra it doesn't matter what she did or didn't do, it matters what the realm thinks. A lesson learned, something earlier in the episode she said was of no consequence. King Viserys informs Rhaenyra now she's going to be forced into marriage with Laenor Velaryon. Rhaenyra says she'll do it like she has a choice, but she also mentions that the king has to remove Otto Hightower as hand, which he does right after he tells Otto that he's not only onto him, he's onto his daughter, who he knows was sent to him as a strategic move. And the best part of this is it's played as if Otto Hightower is absolutely convinced he is doing the right thing for the realm, as treacherous as it is. And he just ran out of cards to play. And the episode ends with Maester Mellos bringing in some tea, which just so happens to be the Westerosi Plan B pill, known as Moon Tea, and we never see her take it, and now two people think that Rhaenyra may have been knocked up. Grand Maester Mellos and King Viserys. I still think the previous episode has been the best of the series so far, but not bad. Not as good as Game of Thrones Season 1, not even close really, but it is in the spirit of the early seasons. While I like the juxtaposition between Alicent and Rhaenyra during the coupling scenes, they all went on just a bit too long. But everything else was good. The acting, the storytelling, the production value, all things you aren't getting from the Rings of Power. And yes, I think the production value is better, even though they spent half as much. And there's another reason this show is succeeding. And it's not just because it's being released weekly. It's being released weekly at a decent hour. You can't have appointment television at 3 a.m. The vast majority of streaming shows that are released all at once are down the memory hole in a couple of weeks, with a few rare exceptions. And imagine how much better those few rare exceptions would have done if they were released weekly at a decent hour. Maybe that's why Netflix is considering getting rid of the binge model. But none of that matters if your show sucks. And so far, The House of the Dragon doesn't. But there are some concerns outside of the much repeated fact that it's a prequel to the total disaster that ended up with Game of Thrones Season 8.
Best season ever!
In 2 weeks, we're going to have two completely new actors playing Alicent Hightower and Rhaenyra Targaryen. People are talking about that birthing scene as something brutal. Well, you ain't seen nothing if they're going to do what they did in the book. Considering society overall has gotten very sensitive lately, I'm not sure how they're going to react to it. Another thing this show is missing is that trademark George R.R. Martin dialogue, and as much as I criticize the man, he's a talented writer, and that's where he excels. Yet we are in unprecedented times. We have two very expensive fantasy series based on fake histories with no characterization and no dialogue, and George R. R. Martin's House of the Dragon is beating J.R.R. Tolkien's in name only billion-dollar loosely adapted Second Age over at Amazon, and that's pathetic. We're almost halfway through the season and we only have one more episode with two major cast members, and I guess we're just gonna have to see how things turn out. Yes, so far I like House of the Dragon. It does not make up for Game of Thrones Season 8, and I'd rather have the Winds of Winter. If you like what you heard, please like, share, and subscribe. If you didn't like what you heard, I thank you for listening this long. I will see you in the next video.
Nerdrotic.com